All right, hello and welcome to today's webinar, Wanted, Dead or Alive, Researching Criminal Ancestors. My name is Trisha Labby, Events Manager here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be your moderator for today's program. This webinar is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie assists library visitors both on-site and online with their family history research. She's an international lecturer who presents on a variety of topics. Melanie holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the State University of New York at Oswego. She previously served as the social media coordinator for the Next Gen Genealogy Network, a nonprofit that creates a community for younger genealogists. She managed their Facebook and Twitter accounts. She continues her interest in helping younger genealogists get involved at American Ancestors by assisting with educational programs from local schools, scout groups, and universities. Some of Melanie's areas of expertise include Irish genealogy, DNA, Atlantic Canada, Jewish genealogy, and military records. The presentation today will focus on useful record groups that exist for tracing your elusive criminal ancestors and how to access those resources for your own research. Melanie will delve into a case study at the end of the presentation as an example of how to apply these records and resources to genealogical research. After Melanie's presentation, we will have time for questions from you. So at any point during the presentation, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A panel. To access that panel, you can click on the Q&A button found with your Zoom controls, type and submit any questions to us. We'll address those at the end of the presentation. In this Zoom webinar, you have the ability to turn on live closed captioning. Located near your other Zoom controls, you will either see a closed captioning live transcript button or a 3-dot ellipses button. If you click on one of those, you'll have the option to choose live transcription, and this will enable the transcriptions to show on your screen as we talk. We invite you to turn that feature on if you wish. There is no handout for this lecture, but the session is being recorded and you'll have access to that recording on our website and YouTube free of charge. So if you miss anything during our live broadcast today or can't stay for the entire session, not to worry, you can always review the presentation later. I'll be sending out a follow-up email to all registrants with the recording link later today. Without further ado, I will pass things over to Melanie to get started.
Okay, thank you, Trisha, for that warm welcome, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a very wonderful presentation that I loved to give last year virtually, and I'm happy to be presenting it with all of you. So, Wanted, Dead or Alive. If you're a Bon Jovi fan, you recognize the name of the title there. And I think criminals have always, influenced us and inspired us to kind of find out more about their story. There's something about, these individuals that, even in the process of them getting away from the law and, being involved in all their different crimes, there's something about it that just attracts us to their story. Think of Bonnie and Clyde and how much they've been romanticized over time as they went on their crime sprees across the United States. Or even, such influences such as John Herbert Dillinger, who was wanted by the FBI during this time, and really made a mark on criminals that we know of today, and to the point that even almost 100 years later, we know who they are now. We're going to be talking about several different record sets on how you can research a criminal in your family tree, or maybe just someone you're interested in. We're going to be reviewing newspapers, census records, jail and prison records, court records, FBI files, and execution records. As Trisha mentioned, we're going to be following with a case study that shows how you can learn a little bit more about a particular person. So let's start with newspapers. That's really how we really start to find out more about a particular criminal in mind, that we're trying to find out more about what they did. And we like to see all kinds of headlines. Going back to Bonnie and Clyde, there were many different articles that were published across their crime spree. And we'll see very famous photographs like the one up here where Bonnie is playfully, holding the gun off at her lover, Clyde. And there's just so much that people want to know about them, even to the point of knowing about their death, where in the center panel we see the actual car and how it was shot up over time. And you'll see how there's many different articles on the screen here that talk about how they were killed, even to, of course, the story of Bonnie and Clyde in verse, which many people can recite now. And even just, Bonnie's mother talking about how she was a good girl gone wrong, and talking about more about what maybe her life was like, raising her. Continuing on, if we want to look at other types of different crimes that we see in newspapers, we can see the train robberies. How many times have we seen these old movies where there's a heist taking place where a gang of desperados are coming up and going onto a train and robbing everybody? Well, it did happen, and there were certain cases like this where we see that there was 7 masked men that had actually robbed a train, that was carrying mail and passengers. And we also can see cases that were published even worldwide. The Sacco and Vanzetti case was quite famous, in which there were worldwide demonstrations that were protesting that they were to be executed. And even with everybody appealing all the way to the Supreme Court, unfortunately, they were actually executed. They were 2 immigrant Italian anarchists, and they were convicted of a murder of a security guard at a store here in Braintree, Massachusetts at time. And you'll see that there's even a full timeline chronology describing everything that had happened over this. And unfortunately, they actually were convicted and had died in the electric chair. And there's still a lot of speculation today on if they truly were guilty or if they were being railroaded during this time. And sometimes we don't see the biggest articles about a particular criminal, and we might see smaller ones like this. This was about the trial of Mrs. Hawley in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So in the trial of Mrs. Florence Hawley being charged for murder, evidence was given that the sister of the murdered Mrs. Munson, Mary Oster, had testified that Mrs. Hawley had actually threatened her life, and that the case had rested and the court was adjourning. So sometimes you'll find very small notices like this that talk about the proceedings. And we may even hear about news overseas. So in this New England newspaper, we actually learned of a murder that had taken place all the way in Prussia at that time, where we learned that a farmer's wife of the name of Weishval at Wilkischken in Russia had poisoned with arsenic her daughter, a girl who was about 15 years of age, for fear that she would make it known that her mother had stolen some geese. After the crime was discovered, she confessed that 2 years ago she dispatched her father-in-law in the same manner to inherit the property sooner, and then 5 months ago had also dispatched the husband of her eldest daughter in order to marry her off to a richer man. Another type of record set that we can learn about if someone is a criminal is using the census records, and this might be one of the ones that you might turn to first. So we're going to look for different clues when we're going to on the census. So in this case here, we're seeing that there is Samuel is a guard. So if you're finding someone that is a guard of a particular institution, that could be a good sign of you're looking at a particular condition here. And we actually see going further down, there's Henry in 1839. He had actually under condition had noted his crime. So it looks like it said murder, and then the one underneath it for Joseph Lucas is actually larceny. So in this case here, while it doesn't look obvious, they actually do show the staff of the prison and then who is actually incarcerated and what their crime was. But we have to be very careful when using census records, because even though we see the term inmate, that doesn't mean that they were a prisoner. Inmate is a term to be used when someone is in some type of institution. So the institution, as we'll see on this next slide, could be a particular type of like a hospital or another place where someone's being kept. In this case, we're seeing that there is a group of people that are at a poor farm, a poorhouse. And then, so these are inmates that are likely paupers that are having room and board provided. So they didn't break the law in this case. They might have just been poor and were being supported. And sometimes you'll get even more clues on different records, even in the state census records, where you'll find out more about these institutions, where here was one for the home for the aged men and aged couples. So looking at senior homes as well. So you always want to look at the top of the census record as well to see if the name of the institution was also specifically named. Now, if there's a couple tricks on how you can use different census records. One database on Ancestry has the 1880 Federal Census Schedules of defective, dependent, and delinquent classes. These type of schedules can actually allow you to view different types of persons that are in different institutions, which can include prisons. Now, if you typically were looking for someone in a prison, under schedule type, if you type in inhabitants in prison, exactly as I put on the screen here, and type exact, it will actually pull up people that are in prison. So that's a way to narrow down if someone's actually in a jail or prison, or if they are just in a poor farm or hospital. So as we can see here we have different entries that come up with that search term. And you can see a little bit of the preview of their name and their residence at the time. So you'll obviously need to click into the view record to find out more. So if we wanted to look at Joseph Connolly, for example, he is in Chicago, Illinois, and he's showing an inhabitant in prison. So if we want to know more, we're going to actually go to the image. And we see here that there is Joseph Connolly is with several others, and they are in a reformatory institution at this time. Joseph was actually convicted of petty larceny, as we can see on the far right. Now, once you've kind of established that someone has already been incarcerated in some form, the next place you may want to check is jail records. Now, with jail records, these are largely going to be at a county or a local level. So in this case, we're looking at the Suffolk County, Massachusetts jail registers, and they give you quite a bit of information. So you get their name, their birthplace, which can even include the country if they were an immigrant, where they're currently living, their race, their age, their sex, their height, down to their occupation. And then, of course, we get into the details on what their offense was, where the authority was taking place, so where they might have been arrested from, and who was actually handling it from what jurisdiction. If they were already sentenced, or if they were going to trial yet, or just being held, when they were discharged, how they were discharged. And this can be very valuable because they may tell you if someone has been transferred or sent out to a particular institution. In one case here, we see that William Keating actually was charged with robbery in Charlestown. He went to trial and was actually found not guilty. So in some cases, you'll actually find out the actual outcome and find that someone had actually been let out. And we'll see the length of the sentence and number of days in jail as well. Now, how do we find the jail records? That's probably a question I'm sure that's on a lot of your minds. And one place we can look at is on Family Search. When we go into the card catalog, we look under the correctional institutions category. Typically going to be at the county level, but sometimes you may find it at a local level as well, or state. So in this case, we see the Suffolk County, Massachusetts Sheriff's Records. So jail records can show up as also sheriff's records. So they might find different names for these. And they give the same information that we mentioned that we saw here. So their birthplace, their residence, height, occupation, and the offense. These actually are records that have been digitized from the Massachusetts State Archives. And we often find in these different indexes that they might give other information, such as the different calendars that have taken place. So within the sheriff's records, we might find different times that someone might have been convicted and at what point when they were actually being brought up to court. And these records can then be viewed to see, to find out more detail by clicking on the camera icon on the right. So in this case, we actually can find even debtors' jail records, because that was something that was happening for quite a time, where if you couldn't pay your bills and you had accruing debts, you could be sent to debtors' jail. So these are actually records from about 1799 in the Boston area. And we see here that the names of the individuals at who was sent, when they were committed, where they were living, and when they were discharged. So in some cases, they were usually discharged by a creditor, might have come to actually help them settle out the debt, swore out, or maybe someone came forward and helped them pay it. Now, there's other types of records you can find in jail records, which also can include mug books. So let's say you're looking for those mug shots. Certain cities and counties may already have these mug shots that you can look at. This is quite a unique collection of the city of Sacramento police mug books from 1860 to 1915 that was actually digitized and published by the Root Cellar Sacramento Genealogical Society. As you can see on the next screen, this is not your normal mugshot. You're not seeing someone holding up a little placard with their number and looking, one way and then sideways. They actually look like very dapper gentlemen. They look like they're just doing a portrait sitting. Well, apparently it turns out that at this time, Sacramento did not have a photographer on site in the jail to actually take the mugshots. So they would actually go out into town and have a local photographer take the shots, and they would sit like this. So maybe when you're looking at that portrait sitting of some nice gentlemen, you may want to question, are they actually there of their own volition, or is that maybe their mugshot before they go back to jail? So we looked at the local level at jail records. Now we're going to examine the state prison records. State prison records also can be found online. So we're going to go back to Family Search. And in this case, we're going to look at Charlestown State Prison records. And as you can see, a lot of these records are generally going to be about 100 years old or so, maybe a little later at times, of what's actually available and what is archival. So these records have already been turned over to the Massachusetts State Archives and have been digitized. So within these records, we may see only a portion of what's actually at the archives at this time. So we're going to find an index, different entries of convicts that have went there, commitment registers, wardens records, and recommitment registers. So with the commitment registers, this is when someone is first been entered into the prison, and they're going to be and the paperwork has been started. So think of it almost like when you're looking at almshouse records, when you're seeing someone first entered in. This is the admittance record, and in a lot of cases, you're going to find that there is an index. So you can go in here, and depending on how they're organized, they're usually organized somewhat alphabetically. And then you can look and see if you could find a particular person that you're interested in, that you want to look at. So here we see their number, their name, as well as what happened to them. Were they discharged? Were they pardoned? Did they die? Those are all things that can be learned of here. So once we get into the registers, we're going to look for the particular time period that we're interested in. So in this case, we're looking at a register between 1818 and 1840. And we find this record for Samuel Wild that we saw earlier, set for number 769. We see here that he's about 33 years old, that he was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and that he was convicted in Dedham, Massachusetts. And it even noted that it was also his second sentence. And his crime was receiving stolen goods. It notes here that he was received on, looks like February 26, 1826. And it even includes some remarks here that he was even sentenced to solitary. So went to 5 days there and then to probably hard labor of 1 year. He was then discharged on March 3rd, 1827. So that would be his release date. Now, sometimes we find that these criminals, they have a way of coming back to prison. So this is what we mean by the recommitment registers, who have been committed to the prison twice. And a lot of this is the same information that we see. So we see their name, their age, the crimes, where they were born, when they were committed, the term of the sentence, and their remarks. And I don't know, sometimes third time's a charm, you might find them again, or you may find that they were, fully pardoned or discharged at that time. Now, if you want to learn more about someone in prison, there are actually case files that you can request. Now, sometimes there are going to be restrictions on what's available, especially with how recent they are. So in this case, the Massachusetts State Archives has inmate case files between 1910 and 1941 available. And it notes here a little bit about the institution. So we can actually go to the archive grid link to find out more about this particular collection. So here we see a little bit more, and it even gives you a little bit of a map of where the Massachusetts State Archives is. So if you ever wanted to visit in person and you were able to look at them in person. And it notes here that this was the facility for a male offender sentenced to solitary and confinement hard labor, and that these case files are going to include information on their education, their family, their military service, their economic backgrounds, their medical reports, police reports, fingerprints, photographs, pardon summaries, and more. Huge amount of detail in there. I can tell you these files contain a lot of information. The key is trying to get access to them to be able to see the records. You also can look at different archives for different types of state prison records. At American Ancestors, we actually have a unique manuscript of state prison physicians' records between 1816 and 1817. They include the date, the surname of the person, and the medical treatment they were receiving during this time. So it might give you an idea of what conditions were like in prison. So on this right-hand side, you can see actually a page out of this manuscript, so you can see what they were being treated for. And in a lot of cases, there were certain solutions and different medicine that was given. I know I've seen Fowler solution, a couple other ones that were given for a lot of different infections that were being treated over time. So it may give you a sense of what life was like for them and how their health might have been. Now, in addition to the actual state prison records and the case files, there also are some cemeteries that are set up for state prisons. Now, unlike other cemeteries, there's not going to be full burial records of each inmate. And the reason why is that usually the inmates are not marked with a particular own marker. They're usually just buried in that particular field. And there might be a notation that they were buried there, and that's probably it. But if it's something you want to look at to actually, see where someone's final resting place is, there are certain prison cemeteries actually on sites like this on Find a Grave, such as the Wethersfield State Prison. And at these different state prison cemeteries, you may even find these different placards that talk about what the cemeteries were set up as, some of the first and second cemeteries in this case. They even had a photograph, it looked like. There was a prisoner with a piglet that was being photographed here. And just noting, exactly where the different cemeteries were, and maybe even a little history here. So one of the noteworthy interments that was noted on the first cemetery was inmate Prince Mortimer. He was an enslaved African-American who was convicted of murdering his master by arsenic poisoning. And he had died in 1834 at the age of 110. So he is someone that actually is buried in that cemetery. Now moving on, we're going to look at federal prison records and what can be found there. Federal prison records are under the purview of the National Archives, and they have records for many different penitentiaries, including Alcatraz, Atlanta, Leavenworth, McNeil Island. They also include records for the boards of parole. And a lot of these records are becoming more available and digitized. So this gives you a small snapshot of where the National Archives currently is with a lot of the different records. So in many cases, they will have a name index to case files that can be ordered from them. They may have different documents that are related to different prisons. Alcatraz is actually a very popular one right now, where they've been doing a lot of work with it. And they even have photographs of some of these prisoners as well, as you can see here with a mugshot of the Birdman of Alcatraz. So here's a trick if you want to see what other records might exist. When you're in the National Archives catalog, you can actually search on the name of the prison in the toolbar. And then on the left-hand side, you want to look at where it says refined by data source. If you filter on archival descriptions with digital objects, you are now searching for things in the catalog that have some kind of digital image that you can view, whether a document or a photograph. So in this case, I'm seeing that there's a few case files of former inmates incarcerated at Alcatraz. So a particular person that we're going to look at here is for James Joseph Whitey Bulger, who was actually received at Alcatraz. And we can see that he has a case file that was noted here. And when we find in the catalog entry, we can actually click on that description to open up the file. And here we can see his actual sentence data record. It notes here information about all the different offenses on his rap sheet for what he was convicted from. So all the different robberies. It talks about when his sentencing began, when he was eligible for parole. It would note if he had any good time forfeited or withheld, any kind of disciplinary action that would have taken place. So it gives you a really nice snapshot into what life might have been like in prison. And as I mentioned, there was the Birdman of Alcatraz here. Well, here's actually a page, what's called from the warden's notebook. So the warden would actually have all these different notes on all the different inmates. And we have here that he was convicted of murder. He was serving a life sentence. And it noted about his medical history, his occupation, his religion, his reasons for transfer, and fully down to criminal history. So you can learn quite a bit of detail about here. And of course, there's a photograph of him. Now, there's other databases that you can use to find more federal prison records. So on Ancestry, a lot of these federal prison records are starting to have some of these indexes where you can at least see, did someone you know, and that you're looking maybe in your family tree, had already gone to one of these prisons. So in this case, this is for the McNeil Island photos and records between 1887 and 1939. So here you can do a search of a particular name to see if someone comes up. And then we can see that here is the register of the different prisoners that have been received. So including their name, if they were discharged, when they received, their crime, their sentence, and going all the way through all the dates and the criminal court records. If they had any good time, age, height, weight, and even down to the color of their hair. And you'll also notice that a lot of these crimes are noted as liquor to an Indian. There actually were federal prohibitions against Native Americans drinking alcohol or being sold alcohol. So that's why you're seeing a lot of people that are being convicted for this particular crime at the time. And this continues on to the next page where we can actually see all the different descriptions of the person, such as their complexion, their eyes, where were they born and where, which is always a key thing we're always looking for, where and when they were arrested. Are their parents living or dead? That could be an interesting thing to look into. In some cases, we even see that the names of the parents are listed. So that's quite good when you're looking for genealogy information. Their residence, their occupation, can they read or write? How long are they in jail? Guilty, not guilty? What offense are they up to at this point, etc. And then, of course, we have the prisoner photographs. So similar to like mugshots, you might see actual photographs when they went in, and you'll note that they have their number on them as a way of identification. So in this case, I love this photograph because he looks like just a very charming man with his hat here, you know, and as he was being photographed, and you could just kind of like look right into his eyes on this. And there's other indexes you can find on Ancestry, such as Alcatraz, between 1934 and 1963. So here again, you can do a search on a particular name if someone you're interested in. So in this case, I did a search on Clayton Robert Smith, who was born in Yellow Creek, Tennessee. I can see his parents' names were Paul L. Smith and mother's name is Hattie. He had died July 15, 1962, in prison in Florida. He was received at Alcatraz in 1949 for desertion, assault and robbery, military related, and notes down to his inmate number 833 and case file information. So with this information in mind, you could then contact the National Archives to request a copy of his file and see if they'd be willing to copy and scan it for you. The National Park Service has also been putting a lot of different pages together for some of these prisons, including Alcatraz Island, where you can really get into some of the artifacts. They actually have noted things that have been made by inmates during this time, different photographs and documents. Obviously, Escape from Alcatraz, very famous movie, how people escaped. And just talking about what the history of the island was like. Here you can get information about people that worked there, what their procedures like, what they ate or drank. So you really can get some insight into what it's like on the rock. And in some cases, you can even see more mugshots like this. So you maybe even be able to find someone's mugshot directly on a site like this through the National Park Service. So we want to look into more details about the actual process of how they got to jail or prison. We then turn to court records to really dig into the actual minutia of it. On family search, there is a key if you want to try to find it. Generally, it's going to be at a county level. So one way you can do is do a keyword search, and I can do one by criminal court records, as I've noted here. This brings up over 1,100 results across the United States and probably even different countries potentially as well, where you can see that there are different records available that you can view. A lot of these records are going to be ones that already have been transferred to the state archives, but there could be cases of ones where individual courts already have the records as well. So in this case, I'm looking at Franklin County Supreme Judicial Court records. And I can see that I have criminal records that are spanning the time period from 1859 to 1927. And each of these volumes is individually indexed, which is great when we're doing our search. Because similar to how we looked for a prisoner in a jail record, we can also look for them in a court record. In this case here, I'm using the hand-done index where I find a Joseph Butler, so it's organized roughly alphabetically. And I can see that this is someone I was interested in, so I would then go to page 531 of that volume to find the corresponding court record. And here we see the case of the state versus Joseph Butler, where he was being indicted for keeping and maintaining a gambling nuisance. So he might have had something a little on the side, maybe a little casino or something nearby that he kind of ran out of his home or somewhere nearby a business, and had noted that he was gone through this term and that he was then sentenced to, he had pleaded guilty and was sentenced to pay a fine of $100 in this case. Now, if you're really interested in colonial America criminals, we also want to look at things like the Salem witchcraft trials, because this is where we learn about all these poor people that were accused of horrible crimes and executed. And there's so much detail you can really uncover about what life was like during this hysteria. And through this project, through the Library of Virginia, they actually have the different court records and record books available that talk about the Salem witch trials. We're actually going to have a upcoming event in a few months where we're going to be talking more about the Salem witch trials. So we'll talk more about when that is, and stay tuned. But one thing I'll give you a little snapshot here is that with the Salem Witchcraft Papers on their website, you can actually do a search by an individual accused. So if you wanted to see a particular person that you know of, that maybe you have an early witch in your tree, you can actually see what the court case was like for each of these individuals. So in this case, we see the indictment of Sarah Bassett here, and notes that who she was the wife of, and talking about what her crime was. And here we even see a transcription of the actual indictment that was noted here, that Sarah Bassett, so in case you could have trouble with the handwriting, was wife of William Bassett of Lynn in County of Essex, had upon her about the 23rd of May last year, had detestable acts called witchcraft and sorceries, wickedly, maliciously, and feloniously practiced and exercised at in the town of Salem against one Mary Walcott of Salem, a single woman by which wicked arts the said Mary Talcott is tortured, etc. If you're interested in early English criminals, we like to look at the proceedings of the Old Bailey. This was a very famous court in London, right in the center, in which you might even see different proceedings that took place and might have actually involved your ancestor being transported out somewhere else. And these cover from 1674 to 1913. So on the Old Bailey online.org website, you can actually do a search of the proceedings to see if you have someone in your family tree that was convicted of any kind of crime. In this case, we see some proceedings from May 22nd, 1740, and these were a list of individuals in the middle here that were being transported for 7 years. Noted here, so very likely they could have gone to one of the many British colonies, could have been here in America or Australia or elsewhere. And we even see in other cases where maybe they weren't transported and they were punished in other ways, such as these individuals were burnt in the hand, or in other cases were whipped, or other sentences had done. 3 individuals at the very top we see here have actually been sentenced to death. Another really cool record set that we like to look at for criminals is looking at the FBI files. When whoever helped found this organization, there are all types of things that you can find in these files. These can pertain to individuals that had allegedly broken federal laws, as well as including immigrants who were being investigated at this time, especially during the times of World War I and World War II. We see a lot of cases where people were being spied on and being pursued as possibly being considered, spying on the U.S. on behalf of another country, and they were being investigated further. So one place you can look at is on the FBI case files on fold3.com. These records have actually been uploaded, and these cover quite a few years. So a lot of these are going to be covering really from the early 20th century that we see here. So roughly 1909 and 1921 is what's currently available, what's archival. So if you wanted to look at a particular file, so you can actually pull up the series on the left-hand side. And then once you select the series, now you're going to select the person. So the most common one is the Bureau section files. And then from the publication, this is actually the case. So this is the person's name that's being investigated. And then we see that this is a case number that's been assigned in the parentheses. In this case, I have the Martin A. Mannion FBI case file, in which he was actually a deserter from the military. He had been absent since April 20th of this year. It had noted his address in Philadelphia, and even noted some information about where, his birth date. He was born November 11th, 1901. He enlisted for the Naval Recruiting Station, and that he was ordered to the above training station, and then started for there the same evening, but then was stopped by his father because he had enlisted without his parents' consent and was underage. So, well, he enlisted and they were looking for him at this time. The subject did not have a naval uniform, and then he was turned over to the office, and then the Naval Yard would have conducted a file and would have investigated him further. There's also a type of archives that you can use for FBI records, and it's known as the Vault. This is for Freedom of Information Act files. So these are files that are available that you can actually search for all types of individuals. They could be well-known criminals. They could be individuals that were involved with other types of organized crime, counterterrorism, anti-war, all types of individuals can be found here. So in one case, I wanted to highlight a particular person which you may be familiar with. Well, how about Al Capone? Al Capone had quite a big file here. I mean, he had about 36 pages, and we can see that he had many different materials that were put together talking about how he was sentenced to prison for tax evasion, and all the different bureaus that were investigating him at this time. And one of the other major record sets that we're going to look at today is execution records. When someone has been convicted to death, it leaves quite a paper trail that you can find. Going back to early colonial England, there actually are several published resources which you can use. Daniel Ahern's book, Legal Executions in New England, describes many that were sentenced to death. And you can even find individuals specifically for Connecticut in this case on the Connecticut State Library website, in which they actually have their own database of those that have been convicted in Connecticut, which also includes early witchcraft. Now, for more modern executions, we'll say more in the 20th century, we use the Death Penalty Information Center website. They actually have an execution database that has a bit of information on each individual, which can include the year of execution, where they were executed, their race, etc. So Gary Gilmore was actually the first one to be executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty. He actually had a choice between if he wanted to be hanged or firing squad. He chose to be shot dead and went to go for a firing squad, and was executed on January 17th, 1977. Other records you can look at for executions include the governor's file, because the governor has the power to change the punishment of death to a life sentence, or can even pardon as well. So within the governor's files is where we can often find different records, such as these commutation records, which include for the early 20th century. And most of these records are going to be at individual state archives. So in this case, I'm looking at the Governor Rick Perry execution files from 1970 to 2014. And given the time period, there's actually going to be quite a bit of detail. You're going to get different types of memos and correspondence, petitions, sometimes even videotapes that can be involved. Now, given the possibility, there could be some restrictions, especially if any of the victims' families want anything to be carefully reviewed before it's people in the public. You do have to apply as a researcher to view this, but this gives you a sense of like what could exist if you were trying to pursue an execution file. So if we kind of dig into more of the Governor Rick Perry execution files, we can see a little bit more of a detail on here is part of the collection. So noting that it's including over 38 cubic feet and over 50 files of data. So it's quite huge here, and that you can actually contact the Texas State Archives to find out more. And they also note that they have even case summaries from newspapers here as well. And then further, as you keep going through the finding aid, you get even more detail that talk about the different case files that have been created. So when they were tracking different cases of death row inmates, I mean, this is Texas, so there's quite a few that were executed. And notes here that there might be different case summaries that were prepared with the different prison records. So in a lot of cases, you might find that there might be some duplication between the actual prison case file and the execution file as well. So we're going to end off our class here before we take Q&A with a brief case study of how we can learn more using some of the record sets that we talked about today. So we're going to look at the case of Isaac Levitt. So here's the key details. He was convicted of the murder of a Mrs. Mary Knapp in 1843. So that's what we first went in knowing. And we wanted to put some questions to the test on what we want to know as we're researching. We want to know, what are the circumstances of the murder? What was the sentence? Where was he imprisoned? And how was the sentence received by the local community? And I know that sounds like that could be a little bit hard to figure out, but there actually are ways you can use archives to determine how much of an impact maybe a case had on a community. So starting off with newspapers, we can start to get some details on what actually happened with the murder. So here's an article in the June 28th, 1842 edition of the Boston Post. We learned that a horrid murder was committed on Saturday evening in South Scituate in Plymouth County by a monster named Isaac Levitt, who with a club and scythe murdered the wife of Otis Knapp of that place. Mrs. Knapp, we understand, has left a large family of children. And this was originally published in the Mercantile Journal. So we continue to look for additional newspapers to see, well, what happened next? And in this case, we actually find almost a year later, now we're getting to the actual trial here, in which Isaac Levitt was charged with the murder of Mary Knapp of Scituate in June last, was arraigned at the bar of the Supreme Court this morning. So those are key things we're looking for, is the name of the court that they're actually being arraigned in as well. Judge Wild stated to the prisoner that the nature of the alleged offense and that he was charged with committing the act with malice aforethought. To the question of the clerk whether he wished to retract his plea of guilty, Levitt replied that he killed the woman and did not consider it right to say he did not do so, but he did not do it with malice aforethought. With this explanation, the judge would not permit the plea of guilty to be recorded and appointed Tuesday the 20th of June next for his trial. So he said, I did it, but I didn't mean to do it. So what happened next? We continue to go through the newspapers even more. Go to August 25th, 1843, and we find that he was convicted of the murder of Mary Knapp of Scituate, and that September 28th was to be the day appointed for his execution. And now we get a little more detail about maybe what have happened during this case, about why would he have murdered this woman. With Mrs. Knapp, he went to Boston in June of 1842 and purchased at number 18 Merchants Row 20 gallons of rum, quite a bit. While it's under a maddening influence, the fatal deed was done. The jury could not agree to a verdict of guilty of murder until they had previously determined to prepare and unanimously sign a petition asking that the sentence of death might not be executed. That petition has been received by the executive of the Commonwealth. Public meetings were held in several places and being circulated in different towns, asking the governor's council for a commutation of his punishment. The 24th instant, the legislative will meet and petitions then may be presented. Let the friends of humanity and the followers of him who prayed for his murderer saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Be active in this good work, and the blessings of him who is ready to perish will come upon them. Petitions to the governor and council are in circulation in this town, one of which has been left at this office. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit we're going to see a little bit later about there was actually a petition that was being circulated around that to basically to petition against the death penalty. And we find that there actually was something that actually happened. So the sentence of death was actually commuted to life by the governor and the council, and it was changed to imprisonment for life. So he was not executed after all. So if we want to find out a little bit more about him, we can actually turn to the Charlestown State Prison records. Since this happened in Massachusetts, we would have looked into that would have been the state prison he would have been at the time. We noticed that we have a good range here, 1805 to 1930. So now we can start to look for him in the records. So we start off with going to the index. We have an index 1840 to 1856, which covers the range we're looking at. And we search alphabetically through the names, through the L's, and we find Isaac Levitt, number 3698. And we notice that he was discharged. And then we also had the P, which usually stands for pardon, which we know he was pardoned. So within the actual entry itself for the prison, we can see a little bit more description about what he looked like. He was 47 years old. Looks like he had blue eyes and dark hair. Looks like he was born in Duxbury, Plymouth, Massachusetts. Noted here that he was convicted of murder, and that he did have a sentence of death, and that he was commuted to imprisonment in life, and then a notation about when the discharge was done. Now, if we wanted to find out more about him, especially with that particular petition, there are different files we can look at. So they mentioned that there were council files. So some of these council files have actually been digitized through Harvard's Dataverse. They've actually uploaded the case of Isaac Levitt. It was actually quite a famous case. And as you'll see here, there's actually 206 signatures on this petition. Huge number of people had done it. So you can actually click on the link for where it says original to see the image. And this is where we can actually pull up different petitions. So different petitions that would have taken place have also been digitized over time, as well as other petitions they're digitizing, including anti-slavery and anti-segregation. So when we kind of zoom in a little bit here, we can see a little bit more about this actual petition. And noted that here was at a special session of the Supreme Judicial Court at Plymouth. At last, that Isaac Levitt, an inhabitant of Scituate, the county of Plymouth, was convicted of the murder of Mary Knapp, and being now under sentence of death to be executed on the 28th day of September. That we, the undersigned citizens of the said town in the county, commutely pray for the interposition of executive claim that the punishment may be commuted to confinement of life for the following. And they basically went on in the next page that the crime was committed in sudden frenzy. So basically it was not premeditated. He did not mean to go out and kill this woman. He was very heavily intoxicated. And they even had said that, he was, a bit of an uneducated man, and that this would be, a travesty to sentence him to death at this time. And then they just went on and said that the last time that an execution had taken place, there was a mulatto woman in May of 1727, and that they said that, we really should not be putting anyone to death, and please, let's just, sentence him to imprisonment to life. And it seemed to work because clearly the governor had pardoned him. We also can find in published records, such as this one from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where they publish different documents. You will actually see in different government documents such as this, where they actually list the names of those that have been pardoned during that last year. So here we see that, that Isaac Levitt had officially been pardoned. So in review of this class, there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind is that we need to make sure that we're dissecting every single document for different clues. As you can see, you never know that this might be the place where you're going to find out who their parents are, where their origins are, who their other family members are. There's a lot of good reasons why we're going to find the genealogy information. And then, of course, we want to find out, well, why was someone actually went to jail or arrested, put on trial? Newspapers can be such a crucial record set when we want to fill in gaps, especially as I can mention before, there may be restrictions with accessing certain files. Newspapers can be a way to really fill in on what actually happened while you're maybe waiting to see if you can hear back from archives. And finally, even though there's a lot of things that are online, you will need to pursue other offline repositories to really find out more about your ancestors' story. While obviously we cannot give a glowing recommendation of don't break the law, but criminals leave a good paper trail for us genealogists. So that is kind of a blessing in disguise, in that, your criminal ancestor may not be the person that is talked about widely in your family, but they may be the key to unlocking that next brick wall. And you know what? You might find a good story in there somewhere. And now we'll turn to Tricia to open up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that wonderful overview of resources and a really interesting case study. Before we turn it over to Q&A, we've gotten a lot of your questions in that Q&A panel. Feel free to put more in there. I did want to mention just one program that I think will be especially interesting for this audience, and Melanie teased during her talk. So next month, towards the end of March, we'll be delving deeper into this topic of criminal ancestors with a virtual conversation course, Notorious Relatives, Researching People and Family Stories Outside the Law. So if Melanie taught you anything today, notorious relatives from bootleggers to mob men, petty thieves, gambling ringleaders, whatever they might have done, what their crime was, these infamous ancestors can be found and do leave a paper trail. This online conversation course brings together professionals from a variety of fields to discuss researching outside the law, how to take up the task and techniques of a detective to access solid sources and connect with those who might shed more light on some of the shadowy areas of your family tree. Our panelists are author Russell Shorto, historian and author Debbie Applegate, and our own NEHGS chief genealogist David Allen Lambert, who, as Melanie mentioned, will focus one of his videos on the Salem witch trials. And more information on that. They'll all share inspiring stories about their own research into this topic in various time periods and locations. And this conversation course is a combination of instructive videos, educational resources, and will culminate with a lively panel discussion on Monday, March 29th. This unique course will hopefully give you the traction and tools you need to further your own research. A quick reminder that all paid American Ancestors NEHGS members now receive a 10% discount on all paid virtual programming, so keep that in mind if you'd like to register for this course. And of course, to learn more about this event and many others, we invite you to visit our event calendar at americanancestors.org/events. We'll hope you join us for this special event and many more in the future. So with that plug, let's now turn to some of your questions in that Q&A panel. We'll get to just a few now, but as always, feel free to reach out to us with more detailed questions. So a couple that came through, Melanie, I wanted to start off with some of the more general ones. Could you talk a little bit more about any restrictions on access to these records? Does it vary state by state, or are there certain time restrictions, things like that?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general rule, most things that are going to be what we consider archival are usually over 100 years old. It is up to individual states and state archives on what they will allow you access to, since obviously they want to keep in mind if there are any living descendants, especially maybe the children of said criminals. They want to keep that in mind, what actually is permitted to be seen to protect their privacy as well. So you do need to contact individual institutions to see what will they be willing to grant you access. Do you have to be on site? Can they do a photocopy service for you to find out more? But in general, I find that if things are over 100 years, it's a lot easier to get access to than something that's a lot more recent within the last, let's say, 50 or so years.
Great advice there. Moving on, we had a question about if there was any standard of the types of information that you can find in the documents that you mentioned, specifically what information you can find in court records, and if that information kind of varies state by state as well.
It can. I mean, yeah, from what I saw in the court records, they're generally going to be more of the minutes of it. Now, as you get more contemporary, you may see more trial transcripts that were done by a stenographer where they actually were doing more affidavits and testimony. So it can vary. There are cases where you may actually see full testimony of what happened during that trial, and then others where only what's available is really maybe just the minutes, and then you may have to contact the courthouse to see if there's anything else. So obviously, as we get more recent into the 20th century, you're going to find more details than anything prior, where it's really going to be a summary of here's the basic trial, here's what we did, it was done, here was a sentence, and that's it.
Great, thank you. And another question that we got from a couple people, a lot of the examples that we see of records are really focused on male prisoners. Do you have any experience researching women's prisons, how that access or record keeping might have changed or been different?
So access is going to be similar. Now, we don't always see a lot of female prisoners earlier on, with the exception of like the witchcraft trials, because in a lot of cases, depending on what the crime was, the female prisoners may have also been sent off to mental institutions. So thinking about how they were treating women and the law, they may have, a lot of times I've seen where they were treating women that were committing the crime as more insane than actually intent. So as things get more contemporary, you do see more records with women prisoners, and in a lot of cases they can be very similar. So it's really searching out those different records to see what's available at either the state or a local level.
Great, thank you for going into detail there. Finally, one last question here. We had quite a few people in the Q&A interested in, maybe international records, especially in England. Can you talk a little bit about where one can research the transportation of convicts to Australia from England?
Sure. So there are a couple different places you can look. So one would be the Old Bailey proceedings. That would be a very common one. You would see the transportation. Secondly, there are a variety of different databases that you can find through the National Archives of England. There are different databases on sites like Ancestry and Find My Past, and even individual sites that you can find depending on the time period. So even within Australia, there are different transportation registers that have taken place based on where in Australia they ended up. So you may want to look and see exactly what part of Australia, because that would actually drive which ones might be available. But yeah, there's a bevy of details. When in doubt, Google it, because you can probably pull up a lot of them very quickly and easily to see what's there. And you'll usually find, different indexes and registers. And depending on where they came from, you'd then want to see if there's any proceedings out, back in England, for example.
Great, thank you for going into detail on that. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today for questions, but I want to thank everyone out there for your thoughtful questions, and a reminder that you can always reach out to us with your more specific research questions. We are here to help. If you do have more specific questions, you may consider working with our research services team who conducts research for hire. You can learn more about that by contacting research@nehgs.org. Additionally, you can go to americanancestors.org/chat to take advantage of our free chat with a genealogist service. So this is great if you have a quick reference question. It's free and available to all Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. with some extended hours on Wednesday, 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. So we encourage you to reach out as you continue your research. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and all online offerings, any feedback's extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.